Now, as you can see by the provocative titling on this slide, we are here in part to settle the question of whether or not Pythagoras was the first polymath. He wasn't. We can all just go home. Woo! That's it. No, just kidding. Please don't go home. Pythagoras is, however, widely considered to be among the first of the polymaths. Now, unlike some of those other fine interdisciplinary thinkers that preceded him, Pythagoras was the beginning of a particular line of polymaths that would go on to shape Western culture as we understand it today, and that, in my estimation, is much better than merely being first. It's also why I wanted to talk with you all tonight about him, but before I can begin in earnest, I have to address, or I must issue something of a caveat. I can't in good conscience present the information that I've assembled here for you as fact. Whether by design or circumstance, indisputable historical facts about Pythagoras are pretty hard to come by. So what I'm going to share with you then is sort of a melange of anecdote, speculation, storytelling, and no doubt a few outright lies. It's a good-looking guy. Pythagoras' teachings come to us mostly as hearsay, and they are without a doubt filtered through the beliefs and aspirations of those who followed in his footsteps. We cannot know what Pythagoras' message or his accomplishments may have really been with any more certainty than we can compare and contrast Jesus' original ministry with Paul's Hellenistic interpretation of the meaning of his crucifixion. But we can measure the importance and perhaps the novelty of Pythagoras' message by the deep impression that it left upon history. Pythagoras was born in the first part of the 6th century BCE to a wealthy family from Samos. And there's Samos. It's one of the larger islands that hug the western coast of what is now modern-day Turkey. Now, just for kind of some time context, that birth puts him within one generation of the historical Siddhartha Gautama, the capture of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar II, and the first flourishes of democracy in Athens under the tenure of Solon the lawgiver. It was a long time ago. Pythagoras was the son of a sea merchant who was of Phoenician descent who married into part of the ruling oligarchy on Samos. So we have Samos here, and this is Phoenicia, which is, of course, modern-day Lebanon. What we can know about Pythagoras' upbringing is limited to what we can generalize based on his status and his location. Samos lies on a maritime crossroads between Greek, Egyptian, and Persian cultures. So here we have the Peloponnesus, and then here we have what was largely an ascendant Persian culture, and then here we have Egypt to the bottom. And due to his father's likely profession as a sea merchant, Pythagoras probably would have been familiar with all three of these cultures. It's also reasonable to consider the possibility that he may have even traveled with his father, or at the very least had access to knowledge about these cultures that may have exceeded that of many of his contemporaries. There's a lot of crazy stories associated with Pythagoras' childhood, but we're going to kind of set all of the mythological stuff aside. What we can probably say with some certainty is that when he was probably 13 or 14, he was sent to Miletus, which was a center of learning in that part of Greece, to study in his late teens with Thales, who was a teacher of great renown. I think I have a slide of Thales here. Look at that. It's a teacher of great renown. Look at that beard. He would have been, Thales actually would have been over 70 at that point, and though his own interest in mathematics, logic, geometry, and astronomy would actually dovetail nicely with what we think about Pythagoras' own studies and accomplishments, it's actually more likely that Thales' student, whose name was Anaximander, probably had a more direct hand in his studies. In particular, Pythagoras seems to have appropriated a belief that is attributed to Anaximander, which is that there was a thing called the unlimited that was at the source of existence. And this is opposed to Thales, who is on record essentially as saying that all things were derived from water. So this is an important distinction to make, is that Thales was grounded in the physical realm, whereas Anaximander was more of a metaphysical thinker. Now, after his studies in Miletus, Pythagoras is purported to have traveled to Sidon, which is actually right in the same area where it's supposed that Pythagoras' father came from. It's said that he studied astronomy with the remnant late Babylonian culture that was still there. Now, there's a certain logic that's at work in this supposition. His father, his name was Nisarchus, most likely came from this part of the Mediterranean, and this actually may have been the ancient equivalent of staying with distant relatives while he was studying abroad. As heirs to the Babylonian astronomical tradition, his teachers would have actually had access to the longest contiguous records on the movement of the stars in other celestial bodies. The Babylonian model also played a much greater emphasis on mathematics and sustained observation than their Greek counterparts, which he would have originally been exposed to. And the Greeks really relied on a lot of mythological or cosmological models or explanations to sort of bring order sometimes where there actually wasn't any. So he was studying the data very closely. Here's where it starts to get a little fuzzier. After leaving Sidon, it is said that Pythagoras traveled to Egypt, where he was initiated into a number of mystery religions that also happened to be the repository for the body of Egyptian studies on geometry. Now, one tradition suggests that Pythagoras actually traveled to Egypt under the recommendation of a tyrant who had taken over Samos in his absence, not because he was gone, but it just happened that way, whose name was Polycrates. Now, we can actually date the beginning of Polycrates' reign with some accuracy to about 530 BCE, which would have made Pythagoras probably about 30 years old. There is, again, a certain attractive logic to the idea that Polycrates might have had a motivation in extending Pythagoras' absence from his home, as Pythagoras was actually the member of the kind of powerful, old oligarchic family that Polycrates had actually seized the right to rule from. So if Pythagoras, was a man renowned for his learning, it might be in Polycrates' personal benefit that he not be there, so that Polycrates would not be overshadowed by him. Polycrates is also known for having allied himself for a period of time with the Egyptian military and political interests in response to localized Greek hostility to his seizure of that power. So the idea that he would have had something to do with Pythagoras going to Egypt is not, well, it's not the most ridiculous thing you'll hear tonight. It's also supposed that in addition to bolstering his understanding of geometry, that Pythagoras' studies in Egypt also deepened his interest in metaphysics and the afterlife. His cosmology took on a kind of dualism that's not found in a lot of his Greek contemporaries, as he began to focus on this idea of harmonia that was to be found between Anaximander's concept of the unlimited and a new counterbalancing force that he called limitation. Because of the way that Pythagoras integrated these different ideas contained within geometry and mathematics and logic and astronomy, this quest to locate the harmonia extended into every area of his teaching, and I think was the fuel for his eventual obsession with the almost supernatural quality of numbers. Now, if a trip to Egypt is difficult to prove and maybe strains credulity just for the fact that he would have had to know so many different languages. That's the part about that I find the most challenging, is that a lot of the teachings would have actually been in Egypt, would have actually been captured in languages that the people themselves didn't actually speak. So he would have been learning these languages, basically from the start. And so there are some people who question that maybe he could have picked up some of these ideas somewhere else. But there are two more legs to his academic journeys that bear up, I think, worse under scrutiny. One tradition says that Pythagoras was taken prisoner by the Persians when they invaded Egypt in 525 BCE and was forcibly removed to Babylon. From there, it is supposed by some that he traveled on to India, where he came in contact with what would have been a very young and virulent form of Buddhism. Pythagoras' metaphysical speculation is widely thought to have included both the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. So this firsthand exposure to Buddhism is a very tantalizing prospect to explain why Pythagoras seems to be one of the very few Greeks expounding this particular belief. From a pragmatic standpoint, it seems to me more likely that Pythagoras left Egypt after the Persian invasion and made his way back up through the Levant, perhaps to Sidon, perhaps reconnecting with some of his friends and family there before finally returning to Samos. Now, the Samos that Pythagoras was a really different place than the one that he had left. Polycrates was a politically energetic and in some ways progressive tyrant. He used Samos's wealth to build up a large navy of triremes and had been diligently enslaving his smaller neighbors, like Miletus, with it. He elevated Samos' position to the center in the Greek world of Hera worship by building a lavish temple to her there. And I think I actually have, look how lavish that is. So it's got baths and different elements there. And then this is actually what remains of that temple today. He also strengthened ties to the powerful Pythagorean Oracle, sometimes known as the Delphic Oracle, by hosting a sprawling and very politically conspicuous festival to Apollo on another island that he had recently conquered called Delos. Now, I offer this context as a means of demonstrating that Polycrates was powerful way beyond the limitations of just Samos. And his tyranny, however benevolent and prosperous it may have been, didn't make for the kind of soil in which Pythagoras had hopes of planting his now vast knowledge. So he left Samos after a very short time for a Greek colony called Croton on the southeastern coast of what he knew as Magna Graecia, or what we would know today as modern Italy. One thing, Croton is actually a notable choice for, I think, for several reasons. First of all, it's super far away from Samos, just in the grand scheme of things. If you think about how easy those other places that I showed you could be accessed from Samos, whereas this you would have to, go all the way down here and then all the way up there. So I think that he was trying to get some political space, so to speak. What's interesting also is that Croton is a Greek colony, but it's not the same Greeks that Pythagoras comes from, but colonizers from the northern or Achaean part of the Greek peninsula. Pythagoras was Ionian. It's way far away from the tension that we saw over here between the Persian, the Egyptian, and the Greeks all jousting over these tiny island city-states. It was known in his time as a center for learning about medicine, and also happened to be the home of one of his favorite wrestlers. So there's that. That's going to come back up. Don't forget about the wrestlers. Now, for whatever confluence of reasons, Pythagoras brought his peculiar blend of Egyptian geometry, Babylonian astronomy, Greek logic, and kind of a homebrewed mysticism, and started a school in Croton. Now, of the fact that there was a school, there's very little doubt. What exactly was taught at this school is a matter of basically pure speculation, because the school, or Pythagoras and the school, had an absolute emphasis on the oral transmission of knowledge to the exclusion of all written texts, and of absolute secrecy regarding what that knowledge was. The order seemed to include hierarchies that were based on a series of revealed mysteries, which would also include components of practical study. So students could apply to the school, and in the outer order, known as the listeners, or okousmatikoi, they could expect to receive an education that we would be tempted to call pretty liberal artsy, with only maybe glimpses at the mysticism and deep speculation that was taking place among the inner order. But gifted students could then be recruited into the inner order of mathematikoi, or the learners. Now, these students, at least in the first generation, were those who were initiated into the deep mysteries of Pythagorean mysticism, and most likely taught by Pythagoras himself. So what did they believe? Well, Pythagoras believed, like Anaximander before him, that the foundation of reality had to lie within something that was beyond his senses. So, unlike other Greek philosophers who tried to explain the meaning of fundamental ideas through the physical elements, so this by necessity would be talking about an observation with the senses, Pythagoras turned to reason and saw a world of abstractions that was laying the foundation for the possibilities of the material world. He believed that numbers were the language of that neighboring yet alien kingdom, and that all reality could be understood and predicted by their careful examination. Let's take, for example, the most famous mathematical idea that's associated with Pythagoras' legacy. The Pythagorean theorem, that's right. Now, there is ample evidence that a practical understanding of this mathematical axiom predated Pythagoras by thousands of years. He would have definitely come across it in its application in his studies with the Babylonians and the Egyptians alike. What made his teaching of it different was the application of logic to create its proof, using easy to understand and transmit methods to demonstrate it as being an eternal truth, as opposed to being merely functional like it might be to a carpenter. Much of the outer circle teaching seemed to be about integrating this idea of numerical interrelationship into every area of inquiry, with ratios representing in varying degrees this Pythagorean ideal of harmonia. As some of you may remember, I did a presentation at the festival a couple of years ago about Henry Cowell, composer Henry Cowell, where I talked about that the Pythagoreans had actually had a really surprising and profound impact on the development of music in the West. So by experimenting with musical pitches that were played on a single string, they actually deduced the mathematical relationship of vibration to pitch and laid the foundations for Western music in their conception of harmonia, or as we know it, harmony. If the Pythagoreans if they had been waiting for confirmation that their premise that numbers were the underlying framework of existence, this radical discovery surely gave it to them. They had to look at that and go, how did that happen? Numbers are magical. Now, what evidence that we have suggests that the sect was active in Croton for at least 20 years. The hazy picture painted by the earliest sources suggests that it was more than just a school. It was an order of graded asceticism that became increasingly ingrained into the local politics of the city. By 510 BC, Croton was launching an invasion of its neighboring rival city, Sybaris, led by none other than Pythagoras' favorite wrestler, Milo, and bringing it under Crotonian influence. Now, in what I think was kind of an ironic nod to the troubles that he had in Samos, the ruling oligarchy of Croton seemed to rise up against this Pythagorean influence over local politics, and sometime around the turn of the 5th century, they burned down the school, killed many of its inhabitants, and sent the remainder into flight across the Mediterranean. Now, depending on which story you want to believe, Pythagoras was either killed because he refused to run across a bean field, maybe, or he fled to nearby Metapontum, where he died soon thereafter. Other traditions do exist that say that the school itself wasn't burnt down until the middle of the 5th century and well after Pythagoras' own death. But I'm going to pretend that it was, because none of us know. The Croton massacre, for all intents and purposes, really ends the first age of the Pythagoreans, but not unlike kicking a dandelion, it also spread Pythagorean influence far and wide. Within a generation, books purportedly written by a man named Philolaus, who was a student of Pythagoras's, were in circulation. The fragments that remain demonstrate this cosmology based on limits and limitlessness, opposing one another in harmonia, and, preposterously, suggest that the Earth is a sphere that does not occupy the center of the universe. That's good. But instead orbits around something called the outer fire that is not the sun. Not as good. Our best known sources for the middle period Pythagorean thought after this golden age, and the reason really why we're probably still talking about Pythagoras today, was Plato. There is considerable evidence that both Plato and his teacher Socrates were trained in a Pythagorean tradition. We don't have any reason to believe that there was just one Pythagorean tradition. There may have been competing Pythagorean traditions. We don't know. And we cannot really say anything about Socrates' teachings with any more certainty than we can Pythagoras, due to Socrates' own disdain for the written word, which sounds kind of familiar. We can recognize, though, the abstract realm of formative ideas that underpins reality in Plato's writing. Of Plato's writing, we can perhaps see this Pythagorean influence and its lasting impact on culture most clearly in his dialogue, Timaeus. That which is apprehended by intelligence and reason is always in the same state, but that which is conceived by opinion and with the help of sensation and without reason is always in a process of becoming and perishing and never really is. Now, this separation of reality into idealized forms of reason, in opposition to this idea of the corruptible forms of matter, kind of reflects our own expectations for Pythagorean teaching. Plato goes on to describe various forms of triangles and perfect solids developed in this Pythagorean tradition as the building blocks of matter in a manner that is frankly mostly impenetrable to us today, but at least offers a glimpse of how Pythagoras' number mysticism and sacred geometry might have informed his understanding of the world. Now, Pythagoras' influence would continue through Plato's legacy and would reverberate through the foundations of classic Western culture through the writings of Aristotle, Paul of Tarsus, various unnamed Gnostic Christian writers, Augustine, and much later through the research of Johannes Kepler. Though science was eventually able to divorce the mystical roots that Pythagoras had bound to it so long ago, as astrology gives way to astronomy and alchemy gives way to chemistry, we have Pythagoras to thank for planting the idea that much of what underpinned reality could not be seen or perceived by the senses alone. We would have to wait nearly 2,000 years for better mathematics and better machines to begin to expose that fundamental framework to produce our current appreciation of the cosmos as viewed through the lenses of empirically driven science. But despite these advances, science has never lost its appreciation for mathematics and reason as essential tools for suggesting the contour of the road not yet traveled. Indeed, the harmonia between what can be known and what mathematics suggests that cannot yet be disproven remains the best picture we have of that fundamental reality upon which Pythagoras fixed his remarkable attention now more than 2,500 years ago. Thank you very much.